Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the North Carolina mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In August 1910, the Asheville Citizen newspaper printed a small notice that would mark the beginning of one of Appalachia's darkest mysteries. The article, barely 3 paragraphs long, announced the disappearance of Jill Carlson, aged 28, from her family homestead in the remote mountain community of Harmons Creek. The notice mentioned that local authorities had been contacted, but the matter was initially considered a domestic affair requiring no immediate investigation. The Carlson property sat in a hollow 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense forest and across a swift mountain stream. The homestead consisted of a timber frame cabin, a small barn, and several outbuildings positioned on roughly 30 acres of rocky hillside. Jill had married Robert Carlson in 1907, leaving behind her work as a seamstress in Asheville for the isolated mountain life. The couple had 2 young children, Emma, age 5, and Thomas, age 3. According to county records from the time, Robert had purchased the property in 1906 after working several years in the timber industry. Neighbors who were questioned later described the Carlsons as private but unremarkable, a characterization common for families choosing the solitude of mountain homesteads. The isolation of Harmons Creek was profound even by Appalachian standards. Mail delivery was sporadic, reaching the scattered homesteads only twice monthly. The nearest town, Laurel Ridge, required a full day's journey on horseback. During winter months, heavy snows could cut off communication between properties for weeks at a time. This isolation would prove crucial in the events that followed, creating conditions where a woman could vanish with minimal notice from the outside world. The newspaper's brief announcement concluded by noting that Mrs. Carlson had apparently left her home of her own accord following a domestic disagreement, and no further investigation was deemed necessary at that time. This dismissive conclusion would haunt those involved. As the truth slowly emerged from the mountain shadows, Harmons Creek took its name from an early settler family who had established a mill along the waterway in the 1832nd. By 1910, the settlement consisted of perhaps 20 homesteads scattered across the mountainous terrain, with families living anywhere from 1 to 5 miles apart. The region's isolation was both its appeal and its curse, attracting those seeking independence from society's constraints while simultaneously creating vulnerabilities for the most defenseless. The rugged landscape of steep ridges, narrow hollows, and dense hardwood forests made law enforcement challenging even under ideal circumstances. Sheriff Martin Webb, whose jurisdiction included Harmons Creek, operated from the county seat of Marshall, nearly 20 miles distant over difficult mountain roads. Webb was a capable lawman by the standards of his time, but his resources were limited to himself and 2 deputies responsible for patrolling hundreds of square miles of wilderness, and the postmaster at Laurel Ridge, Edgar Hayes, served as an informal source of information about the scattered families, noting who collected mail and observing changes in routine that might indicate trouble. The Carlsons' nearest neighbors were the Sullivan family, living approximately 2 miles to the east on a slightly larger homestead. James and Sarah Sullivan had settled the area in 1895 and were among the more established families in the region. They would later provide crucial testimony about the Carlsons, though their initial observations seemed unremarkable. Robert Carlson had arrived in the area in 1905, working in the timber camps that harvested the ancient forests covering the mountains. According to employment records preserved in the timber company's ledgers, Robert was a competent worker but prone to conflicts with supervisors and fellow laborers. He purchased his property in 1906 with savings accumulated from his timber work, establishing his homestead before courting and marrying Jill in 1907. The region's history included numerous instances of families simply disappearing into the mountains, sometimes to escape debts or legal troubles, other times to pursue the extreme isolation that the terrain afforded. This context meant that unusual occurrences or unexplained absences were often accepted without extensive questioning. The cultural norm of non-interference in family matters was particularly strong in these mountain communities, where privacy was valued above almost all other considerations. This combination of geographic isolation and cultural reluctance to intrude would create perfect conditions for tragedy to unfold unnoticed. The last confirmed sighting of Jill Carlson by anyone outside her immediate family occurred on July 28, 1910, when Sarah Sullivan made one of her infrequent visits to the Carlson homestead. Sarah later provided a detailed statement to Sheriff Webb describing that encounter, noting that she had walked the 2 miles between properties to deliver some preserves she had made and to inquire after Jill's health, having not seen her in several weeks. According to Sarah's account, she found Jill pale and noticeably thinner than during their last meeting, with dark circles under her eyes suggesting poor sleep. The cabin's interior struck Sarah as unusually sparse, with several items she remembered from previous visits now absent. When she inquired about Jill's well-being, Robert answered before his wife could respond, stating that Jill had been feeling poorly but was recovering. Throughout the visit, which lasted perhaps 20 minutes, Robert remained present in the room, positioning himself between Sarah and Jill in a manner that Sarah found uncomfortable, though not overtly threatening. Jill spoke little during the encounter, offering only brief confirmations of her husband's statements. Sarah recalled that when she directly asked Jill about the children, Jill's eyes filled with tears, though she quickly looked away and said they were well. Robert moved the conversation along, mentioning that he had work to attend to, and gently suggesting that Sarah's visit should conclude. The interaction left Sarah with vague concerns, but nothing concrete enough to warrant action. She mentioned the visit to her husband James that evening, noting that something had felt wrong at the Carlson place, but both agreed that interfering in another family's affairs was inappropriate. The following week, on August 2nd, Robert appeared at the general store in Laurel Ridge, making purchases alone. The store owner, Marcus Webb, the sheriff's cousin, later recalled that Robert bought an unusually large quantity of supplies, including several items typically purchased by women for household use. When Marcus inquired about Mrs. Carlson, Robert responded curtly that she was feeling poorly and had sent him to handle the shopping. This departure from the family's usual pattern of shopping together went noted but unremarked upon at the time. What would not be discovered until much later was that Jill had written a letter to her sister, Margaret, in late July, a letter whose contents would prove crucial to understanding what had transpired in those final weeks. Margaret Porter, 32 years old in 1910, had maintained a close relationship with her younger sister, despite the distance separating Asheville from the mountain settlements. The sisters had grown up together in Asheville, daughters of a school teacher and a clerk, and had remained in regular correspondence after Jill's marriage and moved to Harmon's Creek. Margaret, married to a bookkeeper and mother to one child, had harbored private reservations about Jill's marriage to Robert Carlson from the beginning, finding him sullen and possessive during their brief courtship. In late July 1910, Margaret received a letter from Jill that immediately alarmed her. The letter, written in Jill's careful hand, but showing signs of agitation in the uneven lines and occasional crossed-out words, spoke of Robert's changing moods and Jill's growing sense of being constantly watched. Jill wrote that Robert had become suspicious of her interactions with neighbors, accusing her of planning to leave him and take the children. She described his construction of a new root cellar, noting that he worked on it obsessively at all hours and forbade her from approaching it. Most troubling was Jill's statement that she feared what Robert might do if she attempted to leave, yet she could not continue living under such conditions. The letter concluded with Jill promising to write again soon with a plan for visiting Asheville, though she asked Margaret not to write back immediately as Robert had begun intercepting and reading her mail. Margaret read and reread this letter with mounting concern, but adhered to Jill's request not to respond immediately. 2 weeks passed with no further communication. Margaret sent a careful letter to the Laurel Ridge postmaster, inquiring whether mail addressed to Mrs. Jill Carlson had been collected recently. The postmaster's reply, received in early August, stated that Mr. Robert Carlson had collected mail twice in recent weeks, but that nothing addressed specifically to Mrs. Carlson had arrived. This response, combined with the continued silence from her sister, convinced Margaret that she must travel to Harmons Creek despite the difficulty and expense of the journey. She departed Asheville on August 15th, traveling by train to Marshall and hiring a wagon and driver for the final difficult leg to Harmons Creek. The journey took 2 days, with Margaret forced to spend a night at a rough boarding house in Marshall before continuing into the mountains. Margaret arrived at the Carlson homestead in the late afternoon of August 17th, finding Robert alone with the children in the yard. Robert's expression upon seeing her shifted from surprise to what Margaret later described as barely concealed hostility. When she asked immediately about Jill's whereabouts, Robert claimed that his wife had left nearly 3 weeks earlier following a dispute about returning to town life. According to Robert's account, Jill had declared that she could no longer tolerate the isolation and hardship of mountain living and had departed on foot, intending to make her way to Laurel Ridge and from there to Asheville. He insisted that she had left voluntarily and had chosen not to take the children, claiming they would be better cared for in the mountains until she established herself in town. Margaret's disbelief was immediate and vociferous. She pointed out that Jill would never abandon her children voluntarily, that she had mentioned no such plans in her recent letter, and that the entire story contradicted everything Margaret knew of her sister's character. Robert's response was to become defensive and then aggressive, stating that Margaret knew nothing of their marriage or the difficulties Jill had experienced adjusting to mountain life. The children, Margaret noted, remained silent throughout this exchange, watching their father's face with what appeared to be fear rather than normal childish curiosity. When Margaret attempted to speak with Emma privately, Robert intervened, stating that the girl had nothing to say and that Margaret's presence was upsetting the household. Margaret's insistence on searching the cabin for some evidence of Jill's departure was met with grudging permission. Inside, she found Jill's best dress still hanging on a peg, her mother's locket on the bedroom dresser, and personal items that Margaret knew her sister treasured. When confronted with these findings, Robert claimed that Jill had been so eager to leave that she took only basic necessities, abandoning everything else in her haste. Margaret's demand to know why Jill had not arrived in Asheville or contacted her family was met with Robert's suggestion that perhaps Jill had decided to go elsewhere, possibly to start a new life away from everyone who knew her. This explanation struck Margaret as absurd, and she informed Robert that she would be contacting the authorities immediately. Robert's response was to order her from his property, threatening to forcibly remove her if necessary. Sheriff Martin Webb arrived at the Carlson homestead on August 21st, 1910, accompanied by one of his deputies and Margaret Porter. Webb was a man of 45 years, experienced in the ways of mountain people and aware of the delicate balance required when investigating matters that involved family privacy. His initial approach was diplomatic, acknowledging Robert's right to manage his household while expressing concern about the welfare of a missing woman. Robert maintained the story he had told Margaret, presenting himself as a wronged husband whose wife had abandoned their family. Webb requested permission to examine the property, which Robert granted with apparent reluctance. The sheriff's observations, documented in his official report filed with the county clerk, noted several details that raised his suspicions. The cabin appeared orderly, but showed signs of recent cleaning more thorough than typical household maintenance. Jill's personal belongings remained in place, including items that Webb agreed seemed unlikely to be left behind by a woman planning to start a new life. Most significantly, Webb observed an area of recently disturbed earth near the newly constructed root cellar, an area roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide that Robert explained as preparation for an expanded garden plot. When Webb questioned the timing of such preparation so late in the growing season, Robert became evasive, claiming that he planned ahead for the following spring. The root cellar itself was examined, revealing a structure built with unusual care and depth for such a remote homestead. The interior extended approximately 8 feet underground, with stone walls and a heavy wooden door secured with a substantial lock. Robert explained that he had built it to provide superior storage for the family's provisions and but Webb noted that the cellar was largely empty despite the season, when it should have been filling with preserved foods for winter. The children presented another concern for Webb. Both Emma and Thomas were unusually quiet during his visit, responding to questions with single words or simple gestures. When Webb asked Emma about her mother, the girl's eyes widened and she looked immediately to her father before stating in a rehearsed tone that Mama had gone away. Thomas, younger and less controlled, began to cry when his mother was mentioned, requiring Robert to comfort him. Webb's private notes, discovered among his personal papers after his death in 1928, revealed that he harbored significant doubts about Robert's account from the beginning. He wrote that Robert's demeanor was wrong for a man whose wife had recently left him, showing more anger than sadness, more defensiveness than confusion. The fresh earth near the root cellar troubled Webb particularly, though without a body or concrete evidence of violence, his authority to pursue the matter was limited. He noted that the children's behavior suggested fear, rather than the normal upset of youngsters whose mother had departed. Despite these concerns, Webb's official report concluded that there was insufficient evidence to suspect foul play, and that as an adult, Mrs. Carlson had the legal right to leave her family if she chose. This conclusion was reached reluctantly, and with the caveat that the investigation would remain open pending any new information. Margaret Porter's fury at this outcome was understandable but legally impotent. As Jill's sister, she had no standing to demand custody of the children or to compel a more thorough investigation without evidence of a crime. Webb privately assured her that he would continue to monitor the situation and encouraged her to contact him if any new information emerged. The limitations of rural law enforcement in 1910 were stark. Without a body, without witnesses, without clear evidence of violence, the sheriff's hands were largely tied. The cultural presumption that family matters were private unless proven otherwise worked in Robert's favor. As summer turned to autumn in 1910, the matter seemed destined to remain unresolved, another mountain mystery among many. The community's response was mixed. Some neighbors, particularly Sarah Sullivan, shared Margaret's suspicions that something terrible had happened to Jill. Others were reluctant to condemn Robert without proof, noting that marriages did fail and women did occasionally leave their families, particularly those who had struggled to adapt to the hardships of mountain life. This division would persist as new evidence slowly emerged, forcing the community to confront uncomfortable questions about what they had observed and what they had chosen to ignore. The children remained at the center of concern, living under Robert's care while exhibiting behaviors that troubled those who interacted with them. Margaret Porter refused to abandon her search for the truth about her sister's fate. Throughout September and into October, she made repeated inquiries with Sheriff Webb, pressing him to pursue the investigation more aggressively. Webb, while sympathetic, maintained that without new evidence or testimony, his hands were tied. The legal framework of the time required concrete proof of a crime before aggressive investigative methods could be employed. A missing adult who might have left voluntarily did not meet the threshold for the kind of intrusive investigation Margaret demanded. Frustrated by official inaction, Margaret took the unusual step of hiring a private detective. Samuel Cross was a former Pinkerton agent who had established an independent practice specializing in cases in rural areas where official law enforcement resources were limited. At 40 years old, Cross had built a reputation for thoroughness and discretion, qualities that made him expensive but effective. Margaret's employment of Cross represented a significant financial burden, requiring her to draw upon savings and family resources, but her determination to learn what had happened to Jill outweighed economic concerns. Cross arrived in Harmon's Creek in late September, establishing himself quietly at a boarding house in Laurel Ridge while beginning his investigation. His approach was methodical, interviewing community members under the guise of being a potential land buyer interested in learning about the area. This cover allowed him to ask questions that might have raised suspicions if his true purpose had been known. Through these conversations, Cross assembled a detailed picture of the Carlson family and the timeline surrounding Jill's disappearance. His interviews with the Sullivans yielded the information about sounds heard in late July. His conversation with the store owner in Laurel Ridge established Robert's unusual purchases and the change in his shopping patterns. Cross also learned of Robert's employment history and his reputation as a difficult and sometimes volatile worker. The detective's most significant discovery came from tracing Robert's financial transactions through the local bank, where the Carlson family maintained a modest account. The bank records, obtained through a cooperative manager who knew Margaret's family, showed a pattern of withdrawals and purchases in July that included significant quantities of quicklime, a substance used primarily for processing animal remains or as a soil amendment, but also known for its properties in accelerating decomposition of organic matter. In late October, Ida Monroe made a discovery that would transform the investigation. While cleaning the Carlson cabin during one of her regular visits, Ida accidentally dislodged a loose floorboard in the main room. Beneath the board, concealed in the small space between the floor and the foundation, she found a leather-bound book that she immediately recognized as a personal journal or diary. The book was small, perhaps 5 inches by 7 inches, with a worn cover and pages filled with feminine handwriting. Ida's first impulse was to replace the board and pretend she had seen nothing, mindful of her position and reluctant to invite trouble. However, her curiosity and growing suspicions overcame her hesitation. She carefully removed the book and examined it, confirming that it belonged to Jill Carlson and contained entries dating from April through late July 1910. The decision Ida faced was significant. Bringing the diary to Robert's attention would likely result in her immediate dismissal and could potentially place her in danger if the book contained incriminating information. Reporting the find to Sheriff Webb would involve her directly in the investigation and might anger Robert regardless of the outcome. After a night of deliberation, Ida chose to contact Margaret Porter rather than either Robert or the authorities, reasoning that, as Jill's sister, Margaret had the strongest claim to her personal writings. Ida arranged to meet Margaret in Laurel Ridge, away from the Carlson property, and presented her with a diary. Margaret's emotional response to holding her sister's journal was intense, but she composed herself enough to begin reading the entries immediately. What she found in those pages confirmed her worst fears and provided the first direct evidence that Jill had been in serious danger before her disappearance. The diary entries began innocuously enough, documenting daily life at the homestead, concerns about the children's health and development, notes about household tasks, and the challenges of mountain living. However, as the weeks progressed into late spring and early summer, the tone shifted dramatically. Jill began recording concerns about Robert's changing behavior, his increasing jealousy and possessiveness, his accusations that she was planning to abandon him, his rage at small perceived slights. An entry from early June described an argument in which Robert had grabbed her roughly, leaving bruises on her arms, an incident she had hidden from others out of shame and fear. Sheriff Webb's response to the diary evidence, ordering a more thorough search of the Carlson property in late October. Robert's initial cooperation turned to hostility as the search expanded. Webb's focus on the root cellar, which Robert claimed contained only preserved foods and supplies. Description of the cellar's unusual depth and the strange acoustics noted by deputies, sounds seeming to echo from beneath the earthen floor. Discovery of Jill's wedding ring, hidden in a jar on one of the cellar shelves, contradicting Robert's claim that she had taken all her jewelry. Robert's explanation that she must have forgotten it, growing increasingly implausible. The winter weather beginning to set in, making further excavation difficult. Webb's decision to post a deputy to monitor the property while planning a more extensive search in spring, the harsh Appalachian winter of 1910 to 1911, effectively halting the investigation. Accounts from Ida Monroe describing Robert's declining mental state, increased paranoia, accusations that neighbors were spying on him, erratic behavior with the children, Robert's dismissal of Ida in December after she questioned him about the wedding ring. The children's care falling entirely to Robert, with concerning reports from the few neighbors who observed them. James Sullivan's testimony about encountering Robert on the mountain trail in January, carrying tools and appearing disoriented, muttering about fixing things and keeping secrets buried. The community's growing isolation during the severe winter, with communication between homesteads becoming nearly impossible. Robert's last visit to Laurel Ridge in early February, where his purchase of additional supplies and disturbed manner alarmed the store owner. The winter months passed slowly for Margaret Porter, who could only wait for weather conditions to improve enough for authorities to resume their investigation. She maintained correspondence with Sheriff Webb, pressing him to act as soon as spring arrived. The delay was agonizing for her, Knowing that evidence might be deteriorating or that Robert might use the time to further conceal his crime, Webb assured her that the property remained under surveillance and that Robert's behavior was being monitored, but the practical limitations imposed by winter weather in the mountains meant that little could be done until the snow melted and the ground thawed. March 1911 brought improved weather and renewed determination from Sheriff Webb. Organization of a comprehensive search party, including Samuel Cross and several local men, systematic excavation of areas around the Carlson property, focusing on locations with disturbed earth. The discovery on March 18, 1911, of human remains approximately 15 feet from the root cellar, buried 4 feet deep. Initial identification of the remains as female, with fragments of fabric consistent with Jill's known clothing. Robert Carlson's attempted flight, stopped by deputies before he could leave the property. Medical examination by Dr. Harrison Cole determining cause of death as blunt force trauma to the skull. The grim reality of Jill's fate finally confirmed 9 months after her disappearance. The community's mixture of vindication and horror at the discovery. The excavation process was methodical and painstaking, with the searchers working in shifts to carefully remove soil and examine each layer for evidence. When the first signs of human remains appeared, the work slowed even further, with Dr. Cole brought to the site to supervise the exposure of the body. The remains were found in what appeared to be a hastily prepared grave, deeper than necessary for simple concealment, but not deep enough to prevent eventual discovery. The position of the body, lying face down with evidence suggesting the hands had been bound, indicated that Jill had been restrained either before or immediately after death. The fabric remnants clinging to the bones included pieces of a dress that Margaret identified as one Jill had owned, providing preliminary confirmation of the victim's identity. Robert's reaction to the discovery was to attempt escape, gathering a few belongings and trying to flee into the surrounding forest. Deputies who had been posted to watch the property intercepted him before he had gone far. His capture was accomplished without violence, though Robert initially resisted before recognizing the futility of flight. His demeanor upon arrest alternated between sullen silence and agitated protestations that the discovery proved nothing, that any number of people might have been buried on his property without his knowledge. These claims rang hollow given the location of the grave and the evidence linking him to the burial. Robert's arrest and transport to the county jail in Marshall. His initial silence giving way to a partial confession during questioning. Account of the events of July 28, 1910, an argument that escalated when Jill declared her intention to leave with the children. Robert's claim that he did not mean to kill her, that the blow had been struck in rage, not premeditation. His description of the panic that followed, the hurried burial under cover of darkness, the construction of elaborate lies to explain her absence. Most disturbing, Robert's admission that he had forced the children to help move their mother's body, threatening them into silence with promises of harm if they spoke. His justification that he had been trying to keep the family together and could not bear the shame of abandonment, the confession's chilling matter-of-fact tone, revealing Robert's distorted reasoning and lack of genuine remorse. Additional details about his purchase of quicklime to accelerate decomposition and his nightly checks of the burial site. Robert's confession came in stages, initially offering minimal admissions before gradually revealing more complete details. He described the argument on July 28 as having been triggered by his discovery that Jill had written to her sister asking for help to leave. He claimed that he had pleaded with Jill to reconsider, that he had promised to change, but that she had refused to listen. According to Robert, the violence had begun when Jill attempted to leave the cabin with the children and he had blocked her path. The confrontation had escalated physically, with Robert striking Jill with a piece of firewood. He insisted that he had not intended to kill her, that the blows had been struck in a moment of rage rather than with premeditated intent. However, the medical evidence suggested otherwise, with Dr. Cole noting that the pattern of injuries indicated repeated, sustained strikes rather than a single blow struck in passion. Robert's account of the aftermath revealed careful planning rather than panicked reaction. He had wrapped Jill's body and waited for darkness before moving it to the burial site he had already prepared near the root cellar. The involvement of young Emma in this process was particularly disturbing, with Robert admitting that he had forced his daughter to help him drag her mother's body from the cabin, threatening the girl with violence if she refused or if she ever revealed what had happened. Legal proceedings beginning in May 1911 at the Madison County Courthouse. The prosecution's case built on the physical evidence, the diary entries, witness testimonies, and Robert's confession. Defense attorney's futile attempt to argue temporary insanity and provocation. Detailed testimony from Margaret Porter about her sister's character and the impossibility of voluntary abandonment. Samuel Cross's presentation of the timeline and evidence of premeditation. The children's situation discussed, but their direct testimony avoided due to their young age and trauma. The trial attracting regional attention, with newspaper coverage depicting the case as evidence of the dangers of mountain isolation. Jury deliberation lasting less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Robert Carlson sentenced to death by hanging, scheduled for August 1911. The community's processing of the tragedy, with debates about warning signs ignored and the cultural reluctance to intervene in family matters. The trial was a relatively brief affair by the standards of capital cases, with the prosecution's evidence so overwhelming that the defense had little room to maneuver. The district solicitor presented the case methodically, beginning with Margaret's testimony about her sister's character and the alarming letter she had received in July. The diary entries were read into the record, providing a chilling documentary of Jill's final months and her growing fear of her husband. Samuel Cross testified about his investigation and the financial records showing Robert's preparation for concealing a body. Dr. Cole's medical testimony established the cause of death and the nature of the injuries. Sheriff Webb described the discovery of the remains and Robert's subsequent confession. The defense attempted to portray Robert as a man driven to temporary insanity by the stress of his wife's threatened departure, but this argument found little purchase with the jury. The evidence of premeditation, including the advance purchase of quicklime and the preparation of the burial site, contradicted any claim of a crime committed in sudden passion. The jury's verdict, reached after less than 4 hours of deliberation, reflected their conclusion that Robert had murdered his wife deliberately and had subsequently engaged in elaborate efforts to conceal his crime. The custody battle over Emma and Thomas Carlson following Robert's conviction, Margaret Porter's petition to adopt her niece and nephew, opposed by Robert's mother, who arrived from Tennessee. Court's eventual decision to grant custody to Margaret, recognizing the children's need for stability and distance from the tragedy. Description of the children's departure from Harmon's Creek in June 1911, leaving behind the only home they had known. Early reports of their adjustment to life in Asheville, Emma's selective mutism persisting for nearly a year, Thomas's violent nightmares, Margaret's dedication to their care despite her own grief for her sister. The psychological scars both children carried, with Emma in particular struggling with guilt over her forced complicity in concealing her mother's death. The limited understanding of childhood trauma in 1911 and the absence of appropriate therapeutic interventions. The children's gradual healing over the following years, though neither would ever fully escape the shadow of that summer in 1910. The custody proceedings were conducted with sensitivity to the children's trauma, with the judge interviewing Margaret and Robert's mother privately rather than requiring public testimony. Margaret's position was that the children needed to be removed from the mountain setting where their mother had been murdered, and that they deserved connection to their maternal family, who could tell them about Jill in positive terms. Robert's mother argued that the children were Carlson's and should remain with their paternal relatives, but her case was weakened by her son's crime and by evidence that she had limited resources to care for 2 young children. The judge's decision in Margaret's favor reflected both practical considerations about the children's welfare and recognition that their healing would require distance from the site of their trauma. Emma and Thomas left Harmon's Creek in June 1911, traveling with Margaret to Asheville, where they would begin new lives far from the mountains. The adjustment was difficult for both children. Emma, who had been forced to participate in concealing her mother's death and had lived for months with the terrible secret, struggled with selective mutism and refused to speak for nearly a year after leaving the mountains. Thomas, younger and with less complete understanding of what had occurred, suffered from nightmares in which he relived fragments of that terrible night. The condemned man's time in the Madison County Jail between May and August 1911, visits from a local minister attempting to secure confession and repentance, Robert's vacillation between defiance and self-pity, never expressing genuine remorse for Jill's death, his letters to his children, intercepted by Margaret and never delivered, in which he attempted to justify his actions and claim continued paternal love, the public interest in the case and the crowd that gathered for the execution on August 15, 1911, description of the hanging, conducted in the courthouse square according to the customs of the time, Robert's final statement, claiming that he had been driven to murder by his wife's betrayal and abandonment, still blaming Jill even at the gallows, the execution's aftermath, and the community's mixed feelings, satisfaction at justice served, but unease about the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst, Robert's burial in an unmarked grave at the edge of the county cemetery. Robert spent his final months in a cell at the county jail, receiving occasional visits from his mother and from Reverend Samuel Harris, who ministered to condemned prisoners. Harris later reported that Robert never truly accepted responsibility for his actions, always framing them as a response to Jill's betrayal rather than as a crime of his own making. The minister's attempts to secure genuine repentance were unsuccessful, with Robert more concerned about his own fate than about the life he had taken or the children he had traumatized. In the final week before his execution, Robert wrote several letters to Emma and Thomas. These letters, which Margaret intercepted and never delivered to the children, attempted to explain his actions in terms that portrayed him as a victim of circumstances rather than as a perpetrator of violence. He wrote of his love for them and his regret that they could not be together, but never acknowledged the full horror of what he had done or the impact it had on their lives. The execution took place on August 15, 1911, in the courthouse square in Marshall. A crowd of several hundred gathered to witness the hanging, reflecting both the public interest in the case and the tradition of public executions as community events. The fate of the Carlson homestead following Robert's execution, the property remaining unsold for years due to its association with the murder, vandalism, and deterioration of the buildings through the 1910 seconds and 1920 seconds, local legends developing around the site, claims of sounds of digging at night, sightings of a woman's figure near where Jill's body had been found. The eventual sale of the property in 1925 to a family from out of state, unaware of its history. Their discovery of Jill's gravesite, marked only by a depression in the earth, and their decision to place a simple stone marker. The home's destruction by fire in 1932 under mysterious circumstances, with the root cellar surviving as the only remnant of the original structures. The site's gradual return to wilderness, with the forest reclaiming what had once been cleared land. The enduring reluctance of locals to venture near the former Carlson property even decades later. The Carlson homestead stood empty after Robert's execution, with no immediate buyers interested in property so strongly associated with murder. The buildings gradually deteriorated as weather and time took their toll. Vandals broke windows and doors, and the cabin's roof began to collapse under winter snows. Local teenagers occasionally dared each other to approach the property at night, telling stories of strange sounds and ghostly apparitions, and many others to strangers. These tales, while likely embellished or entirely fabricated, reflected the community's ongoing discomfort with the site and the tragedy that had occurred there. In 1925, a family from Kentucky purchased the property at a significant discount, either unaware of its history or willing to overlook it for the price. They discovered the location where Jill had been buried, marked by a depression in the earth where the grave had been filled in after her remains were removed. Moved by the story once they learned it, they placed a simple stone marker at the site, engraved with Jill's name and dates. Their occupancy of the property was brief. In 1932, the main cabin was destroyed by fire under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some suspected arson, others believed it was an accident, but the result was the same. The family chose not to rebuild and eventually abandoned the property. The root cellar, built with stone and partially underground, survived the fire and remained as the primary physical remnant of the original homestead. Reflection on the Carlson case from the perspective of the 1,950 seconds when renewed interest in the tragedy emerged. Interview with an elderly Emma Carlson, now Emma Morrison, conducted by a regional historian in 1953. Emma's guarded but revealing account of her memories, the terror of that July night, her father's threats, her mother's final moments, her description of carrying the weight of that secret through her childhood, and how the truth's eventual emergence brought both relief and renewed trauma. Thomas Carlson's refusal to participate in any documentation of the case, having legally changed his name and severed all ties to his past. The case's significance in highlighting the vulnerability of rural women in isolated settings, the limitations of early 20th century law enforcement, and the psychological impact of domestic violence on children. Margaret Porter's death in 1947, having devoted her remaining years to her niece and nephew's welfare. The placing of a proper headstone on Jill's grave in 1951, funded by Emma, with the inscription, Jill Carlson, 1882 to 1910, beloved sister and mother, finally at peace. In 1953, a historian researching Appalachian crime cases contacted Emma, by then Emma Morrison, a married woman living in Virginia. After much hesitation, she agreed to a single interview, conducted in her home with her husband present for support. Emma's account, recorded and preserved in the archives of the North Carolina Historical Society, provided the most direct testimony of what had occurred that terrible night in July 1910. She described hearing the argument between her parents, the sounds of violence, and being forced by her father to help move her mother's body in the darkness. She spoke of the terror of those months afterward, living with the knowledge of what had happened while being threatened into silence. Emma explained that when the truth finally emerged and her father was arrested, she had felt both relief that the terrible secret was no longer hers alone to carry and renewed trauma as the events were publicly discussed and examined. The interview revealed the lasting impact of childhood trauma, with Emma describing decades of nightmares and anxiety that had only gradually diminished with time and distance from the events. Thomas, in contrast, refused all contact with researchers or journalists, having changed his name and moved far from North Carolina. He had severed all connections to his past, a coping mechanism that allowed him to function, but that also meant he carried his trauma in isolation. The enduring lesson that the mountains may hide many secrets, but the truth, however long buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. The final image of the overgrown site where the Carlson cabin once stood, with Jill's memorial standing as the only testament to the tragedy that unfolded there. The case of Jill Carlson stands as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by women in isolated rural settings during the early 20th century. Geographic isolation combined with cultural norms that discouraged interference in family matters created conditions where domestic violence could escalate without intervention. Jill's diary entries documented her recognition of the danger she faced and her attempts to escape, but the very isolation that had attracted Robert to mountain life became a trap from which she could not extricate herself and her children. The limitations of law enforcement in such settings were equally evident. Sheriff Webb's suspicions were correct from the beginning, but without concrete evidence or testimony, he lacked both the legal authority and practical means to pursue an aggressive investigation. The cultural framework of the time placed enormous weight on family privacy and male authority, creating barriers to intervention even when warning signs were visible to neighbors and community members. The psychological impact on the children, particularly Emma, who was forced into complicity with her father's crime, demonstrates the profound and lasting damage of childhood trauma. The limited understanding of such trauma in 1911 meant that Emma and Thomas received no specialized treatment or therapy, instead being expected to forget and move forward. That both children carried the scars of their experience throughout their lives, despite Margaret's loving care, speaks to the deep wounds inflicted by witnessing and being made complicit in a parent's murder of another parent. Today, the site where the Carlson homestead once stood has been largely reclaimed by the forest. The root cellar, That terrible monument to Robert's premeditation and concealment has collapsed and been covered by decades of fallen leaves and growing vegetation. Jill's memorial stone, placed in 1951, remains the only visible marker of what occurred in that isolated hollow. Few visitors ventured to the remote location, and fewer still know the full story of the woman whose name is carved in the weathered granite. The mountains keep their secrets well, but some truths refuse to remain buried forever.